Have you ever noticed how a storm seems powerful only until the air itself stops moving? That same idea plays out in a very different way when a narcissist realizes they no longer have access to your emotions. When you stop reacting, stop engaging, and stop feeding the dynamic, something shifts. The noise they depended on disappears. What's left is silence. And for them, that silence feels far more threatening than any argument ever could. Because the first thing that breaks in a narcissist's mind at that point is the sense of control. And control isn't just something they enjoy, it's the structure they build their entire psychological world on. From the very beginning of a relationship, they tend to observe closely. They pick up patterns in your behavior, your emotional triggers, what excites you, what upsets you, what pulls you in, and what pushes you away. Over time, they assemble an internal map of you, almost like a manual they can refer to whenever they need a reaction. That's where the dynamic starts to turn unhealthy. They don't interact with you in a neutral or emotionally balanced way. Instead, they use different levers: attention, withdrawal, praise, guilt, confusion, even cold silence, to influence how you respond. None of it is grounded in real emotional connection. It becomes a system of management where your feelings are something to be directed rather than respected. And what might look like love on the surface is often closer to possession dressed up as care. But everything in that system depends on one thing: your responsiveness. When you begin to step back emotionally, when you stop chasing clarity, stop over-explaining yourself, stop reacting to every provocation, the structure they built starts to weaken. In their internal world, control is not separate from validation. The two are deeply connected. If they can still make you cry, argue, plead, or even obsess over them, then in their mind, they still hold importance. Your emotional reaction becomes proof that they still have influence over you. That's why silence changes everything. When you no longer respond in the way they expect, when your presence becomes steady instead of reactive, the feedback loop collapses. There's no more emotional signal coming back to them. And although they may not admit it outwardly, they feel that disruption very quickly. People like this are highly attuned to shifts in attention and emotional availability. Even if they act indifferent, something in them registers that the usual pattern is gone. Naturally, they start testing. They might say things designed to provoke you, comments that used to work before, subtle insults, passive-aggressive remarks, or sudden attempts to pull you back into emotional discussion. What they're really doing is checking whether there's still a connection they can activate. They're looking for any sign that you can still be pulled into the cycle. But when those attempts fail, the dynamic changes again. Instead of feeling powerful, they feel exposed. And exposure is something they actively resist, often without even realizing it consciously. Their self-image depends on being seen as important, influential, or emotionally central in some way, whether through admiration, fear, or conflict. Being ignored, especially by someone who once reacted strongly to them, disrupts that identity. At that stage, their mind doesn't usually move towards self-reflection in a healthy sense. Rather than asking, "What did I do that contributed to this distance?" they tend to ask, "How did I lose influence over this person?" The focus shifts away from accountability and toward loss of control. And to avoid the discomfort of that realization, the story gets rewritten. You might suddenly be labeled as distant, ungrateful, cold, or disloyal. The original emotional context gets replaced with a version that protects their ego. In that rewritten narrative, they were not the one who lost control. You were the one who changed. That distortion helps them avoid facing the reality that the connection was never as stable or mutual as it appeared. And even while this internal conflict plays out, externally they may present something completely different. They can appear unaffected, even thriving. New people, new attention, new achievements, whatever creates the impression that they have moved on effortlessly. But often, this becomes another layer of performance. It's not necessarily about genuine healing or growth. It's about regaining a sense of importance. If they can no longer control your response directly, they try to control how the situation looks from the outside. What they often fail to understand is that when someone truly detaches, the emotional process has already happened internally. The disappointment has already been processed. The confusion has already settled. The hope that once kept them engaged has already been questioned and released. What remains is not emotional chaos, but clarity. And clarity removes the hooks that manipulation depends on. At that point, the real loss isn't just the person. It's the loss of the illusion that control ever truly existed in the first place. When a narcissist realizes they no longer have emotional access to you, the reaction can take two common forms. Sometimes it comes out as rage, sudden, intense, and disproportionate to the situation. Other times it turns into cold withdrawal, as if they are erasing all emotional presence entirely. On the surface, these responses look different, but underneath they serve the same purpose: to regain psychological footing and reassert some form of dominance over the emotional space they feel slipping away. This reaction is often tied to what psychologists describe as a narcissistic injury. It's the internal shock that happens when their self-image is challenged or rejected. When you stop reacting, you are no longer reinforcing the role they assigned you in their mind. That break in the pattern doesn't just disappoint them, it destabilizes them. And instead of processing that discomfort internally, it gets redirected outward. That's when the emotional intensity increases. Words become sharper, accusations more personal, and attempts to provoke you more deliberate. The aim is not simply to hurt you, it is to pull you back into engagement. Because even a negative reaction still counts as connection. Even conflict still means access. If emotional outbursts fail to work, the strategy often shifts again. The energy changes from explosive to detached. Silence replaces aggression. Indifference replaces confrontation. But this is not genuine peace. It is withdrawal designed to regain psychological control by pretending the connection no longer matters. Yet underneath both extremes, rage or silence, the same truth remains. The system only functions when you participate in it emotionally. When you stop participating, the structure loses its power. And once that happens, what they are left with is not victory or defeat, but absence. A space where control used to feel real, but no longer exists. Cold silence is one of the most effective tools in a narcissist's emotional pattern. And it's important to understand that this silence isn't calm or neutral. It isn't about reflection or personal space. It carries a different weight entirely. It is used as pressure. It is used as withdrawal with intent. It is designed to create emotional discomfort in the other person, feelings like confusion, rejection, invisibility, or abandonment. The goal behind it is simple: to make you feel the absence so strongly that you reach back into the dynamic just to restore connection. You might notice it in different ways. Messages left unanswered, your presence ignored in shared spaces, a sudden disappearance without explanation. And sometimes, just when you start adjusting to that distance, the silence breaks again, often when they sense your emotional state shifting or your resistance weakening. This isn't about needing time to think. It's not about healthy boundaries or self-regulation. It operates more like a withdrawal tactic, pulling attention away to create emotional imbalance. The expectation is that, over time, that imbalance will push you to seek them out again, simply to relieve the tension. In many cases, this creates a push and pull cycle that becomes deeply destabilizing. One moment there is intensity, arguments, emotional spikes, or reactive behavior. The next moment there is nothing at all. That contrast can be disorienting. It disrupts your internal sense of stability and makes you start questioning your own actions. You might find yourself replaying situations in your mind, wondering if you overreacted, asking whether you should have said something differently, whether you caused the withdrawal. And that internal questioning is exactly where the cycle gains strength. Because once you start doubting your own perception, it becomes easier for the dynamic to reset itself. The intention of this pattern is not always conscious or calculated in a detailed sense, but the effect is consistent, keeping emotional engagement active through instability. Because when you are emotionally engaged, whether through confusion, guilt, or hope, the connection still exists in some form. But something important changes when real detachment begins. When you stop reacting in predictable ways, both extremes lose their effect. The anger no longer pulls you into defense. The silence no longer pulls you into pursuit. The emotional leverage disappears because there is no longer a response being extracted from you. At that point, the behavior that once felt powerful starts to look different. The outburst stops feeling personal. The silence stops feeling meaningful. Instead, both begin to look like patterns rather than truth. Reactions that say more about the other person's internal state than about you. And that shift is unsettling for the person relying on those reactions. Because when the emotional feedback loop breaks, so does their sense of influence. What remains is uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, different strategies often appear. Sometimes there is a return to intensity, attempts to re-engage you emotionally, words designed to reopen communication, reminders of past closeness, efforts to recreate familiarity. Other times, there is a shift towards sympathy, regret, or vulnerability. Statements meant to rebuild emotional access through compassion or nostalgia. If those approaches don't work, the tone may shift again. Distance may return, indifference may be displayed more clearly. New narratives may be created to explain the separation in a way that preserves self-image. The details vary, but the underlying goal remains consistent. Restoring emotional access in whatever form is still possible. But what often gets overlooked is the internal change that happens on the other side. When detachment becomes real, the emotional weight of these patterns begins to fade. You stop interpreting every action as something requiring a response. You stop assigning meaning to every shift in tone. You stop feeling responsible for resolving the emotional instability of someone else. And gradually, what once felt like confusion turns into clarity. You begin to recognize the repetition in the cycle, the way intensity often returns after distance, the way apologies don't always lead to change, the way affection can appear strategically when control feels threatened. Instead of getting pulled into each moment, you start seeing the structure underneath it. That's the point where the dynamic loses its grip. Not because the other person suddenly changes, but because your participation in the cycle changes. The emotional hooks stop catching. The reactions stop feeding the pattern. And without that exchange, the system can't sustain itself in the same way. What once felt overwhelming becomes easier to observe without being pulled in. And what once felt personal starts to feel like repetition. What actually makes manipulation fall apart isn't louder arguments or stronger pushback. It's clarity. And what dismantles control isn't emotional escalation. It's indifference. Because the moment you stop participating in the emotional back and forth, the entire structure that depended on your reactions begins to lose its foundation. The most destabilizing outcome for someone relying on psychological influence isn't being challenged, it's being emotionally irrelevant. When the person who once reacted, explained, defended, or engaged no longer responds at all, the dynamic stops functioning. There is no longer a feedback loop, no more emotional reinforcement, no more signal to work with, just distance. And that kind of distance forces something they usually try to avoid at all costs, a reality that cannot be shaped by reaction, blame, or performance. At that point, silence carries more weight than anything said before, because in the absence of emotional engagement, different strategies often appear. One of the most common is a return to guilt-based framing. The narrative shifts toward memory and obligation. What they claim they gave, what they believe they endured, what they insist was overlooked. Past events get selectively retold. Contributions are magnified, while harm is minimized or reframed entirely. The message is rarely subtle. After everything I did, this is how I'm treated? The purpose of this isn't reflection, it's emotional leverage. It is designed to make you second-guess your perception, to blur your certainty, to reopen internal debate about whether you were too harsh, too distant, or too quick to detach. Guilt becomes the entry point back into emotional engagement. When that doesn't produce the desired response, the narrative often shifts again. This time, the focus moves toward image management. The story is told elsewhere, to friends, family, or any available audience. In this version, roles are reassigned. They become the misunderstood one, the one who tried, the one who stayed, the one who was left behind. Meanwhile, your perspective is reframed as coldness, abandonment, or unfairness. This isn't only about personal validation, it's also about shaping perception externally, because external validation helps stabilize internal uncertainty. If enough people agree with their version of events, it becomes easier for them to maintain it internally as truth. At times, another layer is added: replacement. New attention, new admiration, new validation sources. On the surface, it may look like moving on, but often it functions more like compensation, an attempt to rebuild emotional stability elsewhere while still being unsettled by the loss of influence over you. And even then, attempts to reconnect don't always stop. Because detachment from someone who once responded strongly doesn't just feel like loss, it feels like unresolved tension. Not necessarily emotional attachment in a healthy sense, but disruption of a pattern they depended on. Behind all of these shifts, guilt, image control, replacement attempts, there is usually a growing sense of urgency. Because the emotional signal they relied on is fading. And when that signal weakens, their behavior often becomes more erratic. Multiple strategies can appear within short periods: attempts at warmth followed by withdrawal, persuasion followed by distance, subtle provocation followed by silence. These behaviors aren't stable or emotionally grounded ways of relating to someone. They are reactive adjustments, responses that only appear when the usual emotional flow has been disrupted. In other words, they are not coming from a place of consistent connection, but from a need to regain influence when that influence is weakening. When the dynamic stops producing the same emotional reactions as before, the system they relied on no longer functions in the same way. So instead of stability, you see fluctuation. Instead of consistency, you see switching between different tactics. These shifts aren't random, but they also aren't truly relational in a healthy sense. They are attempts to restore traction in something that is no longer responding the way it used to. And the most important change happens on the other side of that disruption. When real emotional detachment begins to take hold, the internal experience on your side shifts in a fundamental way. The situation is still there, but your relationship to it changes. You are no longer automatically interpreting every action, message, silence, or shift in tone as something deeply meaningful or personally directed at you. The emotional intensity that once filled those moments starts to fade. Instead of reacting to every move, you begin to observe patterns. Instead of feeling pulled into each interaction, you start to see it from a slight distance. The experience becomes less immediate, less consuming, and less emotionally charged. One of the biggest internal changes at this stage is responsibility. Earlier in the cycle, there is often a subtle but heavy feeling that you are responsible for how the other person feels, reacts, or behaves. You may find yourself explaining your actions repeatedly, defending your intentions, or trying to fix misunderstandings that keep repeating. There is a sense that if you communicate better, respond differently, or manage things more carefully, the situation might stabilize. But as detachment grows, that internal responsibility begins to dissolve. You stop feeling like it is your job to regulate the emotional state of someone else. You stop trying to repair every rupture. You stop entering conversations with the goal of preventing escalation or calming emotional volatility. That weight gradually lifts. What replaces it is clarity, not emotional numbness, but clarity of pattern. You start to recognize repetition where earlier there felt like unpredictability. The same cycles that once felt confusing begin to look familiar. Different situations start to reveal similar structures underneath them. The emotional spikes, the sudden shifts, the reappearing themes, they begin to form a pattern you can see rather than something you are trapped inside. This shift is crucial because emotional intensity depends heavily on uncertainty. When something feels unpredictable, the mind stays engaged, trying to make sense of it, trying to find stability inside it. But when patterns become visible, the emotional grip weakens. You are no longer inside the confusion, you are observing it. At this point, something significant changes in the overall dynamic. Emotional participation decreases, and emotional participation is what sustains the entire system. It is not just reacting, it is caring, explaining, engaging, analyzing, hoping, and emotionally investing in the next response. When that participation is active, the dynamic stays alive because every interaction continues to have emotional fuel behind it. But when participation starts to fade, the structure changes. Not instantly, but steadily. The same behaviors may still appear on the other side, but they no longer produce the same internal reaction. What once triggered anxiety, hope, frustration, or confusion now produces less intensity. The emotional hooks stop landing in the same way. And without that participation, the system loses its reinforcement loop. What remains is not chaos, even though it may have felt like chaos before. What remains is structure, but structure that can now be seen clearly. You begin to recognize how the cycle operates rather than being pulled into it. The emotional fog lifts, and what was once experienced from the inside becomes understandable from a slight distance. This is where the real shift happens. Because the external situation may not change immediately, but your internal response no longer matches it in the same way. And when your response changes, the entire meaning of the dynamic changes with it. What once felt powerful loses its emotional weight. What once felt confusing becomes predictable. And what once felt controlling loses its grip, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer has the same access to your emotional system.